continuing to talk about some more examples would be a really nice idea. And you already mentioned, well, I think of him as H.P. Lovecraft. I think you called him Howard Philip Lovecraft. Is that what his?
Howard Phillips, I did that somewhat ironically. HP is the standard.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I got his name right. But anyway, Howard Philip Lovecraft, and you wrote a book, Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy, that connects the two. And as I was looking through the book, something that you said jumped out at me. And after having talked to you so far in this conversation, it seems like I must be getting this quote wrong. But so what you said is, while Hume thinks that objects are a simple amassing of familiar qualities, Lovecraft resembles Braque, Picasso, and the philosopher Edmund Husserl by slicing an object into vast cross-sections of qualities, planes, or adumbrations, which even when added up do not exhaust the reality of the object they compose. And actually, now that I read it, though, I think I do see what you were saying. So Hume is the literalist who thinks
Yes.
that an object, like a piece of art, is just the sum of its qualities. But
Right.
these Picasso, Husserl, Braque, and you argue Lovecraft think that there is something more to the object, the art object.
That's right. And you can see that in The Call of Cthulhu, his first story in that group of stories, where he talks about a statue being made by the artist. And I don't have it in front of me now, but I remember more or less what it says. It says it would not be entirely inaccurate to call the image a kind of combination of a pulpy tentacled head with a dragon-like torso and a vaguely humanoid outline. He says, and yet it was the general outline of the whole which made it truly disturbing. So the general outline of the whole is something over and above those three qualities that we've heard: the octopus head, the dragon body, and the somewhat humanoid posture. That somehow there's something over and above those three qualities. It's like, there's Hume's famous example of the Golden Mountain. You can imagine Lovecraft writing about Hume's Golden Mountain and saying it would not be entirely inaccurate to call it a regular mountain that somehow had a golden color. And yet it was the general outline of the whole that made the Golden Mountain truly disturbing. So something's amiss there in the relation between the object and its qualities. It has those three qualities, and yet it doesn't have them. And this is one of the staples of Lovecraft's fiction. The fact that his descriptions always fail. And he doesn't just say it was so weird that nobody could possibly describe it. That's a cliche of bad fiction, right? Instead, he makes the effort while also kind of letting you know that his effort is not quite succeeding. There's a similar example in his story, The Dunwich Horror, where Wilbur Whatley, who's not quite a human creature, he's half human and half monster, is killed by a guard dog on the floor of the Miskatonic University Library and begins to degenerate. And he says, what was on the floor of the library? He says, it would be trite and not wholly accurate to say that no human pen could describe it. So he's undercutting the cliche. But then he says something like, and yet it would be proper to say that it could not be vividly visualized by anyone whose ideas of aspect and contour were excessively bound up with the known life forms of planet Earth and its three dimensions. So he's hinting at something seriously wrong with the geometry of this creature. And then he goes on to try to describe it. And he goes on to try to describe it by all of these crazy descriptions that you can't quite integrate in your mind, which I think is a different sort of tension. That first tension, the one where you've got the mysterious object that has all these qualities on the surface, okay, we might call that a Kantian tension. That's like the thing in itself that leaves all these qualities sitting on the surface, but you can't quite get at the object because there's a general outline of the whole that can't quite be put in words. Then there's the other tension in Lovecraft. There's actually four of them, but they're the two main ones. The second one is the one where he's talking about an object where the object isn't mysterious, but it's the sheer amassing of qualities that you can't possibly master. And the clearest example I give in my book is, you remember that, the architectural one?
Oh,
In
I was just commenting. I mean, we're back to finitude again.
oh, finite. Oh, okay. Yeah, right. That's that's the Kantian side of Lovecraft. But then
Hmm.
there's the example of in At the Mountains of Madness when the character sees the reflection of the colossal Antarctic city in the clouds, and he describes it, and he doesn't say anything like no human pen could quite do it justice. He acts as though it's easy to describe it, and then he starts listing all the qualities of this city, and there's like 17 qualities, and they're impossible to integrate in your mind. It's like there were beetling table-like figures and curious needle-like spires in clusters of five, and all of these really strange descriptions that you couldn't put together easily. And this is what reminded me of Cubism. The fact that in Cubism, in painting, and also in Husserl's descriptions of objects, there's nothing hidden or withdrawn or mysterious. There's nothing Kantian in Picasso or in Husserl. That's ruled out. Everything's put on the surface for a reason. That's what Cubist painting is. It's just that there are so many incongruent facets of a thing in a Cubist painting, or even in a phenomenological description, that it's very hard to integrate them all together into one object. So the tension between the object and its qualities is brought about in a different way there. Lovecraft is a master of both of those in his prose. And then I go on to say there are two other kinds that also appear in his prose less frequently. But there are four in Triple O, four tensions between objects and their qualities, which I argue are the root of time, space, and what I call essence and eidos. That what we normally think of as time and space are really just tensions between objects and their qualities. But that's another can of worms. In terms of Lovecraft, I think what's so important about him is he is able to vividly give the reader the sense of this reality that objects and their qualities are really out of joint. And this is what is causing so much emotional and mental disturbance for his characters. Many of his characters end up in insane asylums or commit suicide in these stories for a reason, because the things that happen in his stories are much more horrifying than any of the knowledge we think we already have. And he'll often say things like that story, The Color Out of Space, that was made into a movie a couple of years ago. He starts talking about this strange iridescent color that came from outer space and landed in the well in this piece of property in Massachusetts. Then at one point he says, really, we could call it color only by analogy. So we're getting into scholastic metaphysics there in a way that you can't even really say it's color. And then he says the same thing in the Dunwich Horror about the sound made by the monster on the mountaintop. He says, again, it's really only sound by analogy because it had a kind of ghastly infra-bass timbre that spoke to human senses deeper and older than hearing. So it's sort of like sound, but it's not quite sound. Or it's sort of like color analogically, but it's not quite color. Lovecraft is the master of this, and this is why he's so horrifying. I think this is also why he's very hard to film adequately, because you can't really visually represent these tensions the way a filmmaker would want to, or the way a painter would want to. Lovecraft paintings are usually kitsch. You know, they just show some giant octopus creature with dragon wings shambling around.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like bad fantasy art, but as a writer, it works.
Right. There's something very particular about the medium that lends itself to the imagination right. in a way that visual representation just can't get at. But you are very much succeeding in making me want to read Lovecraft. And it's also quite funny that what you've described as his failing descriptions, it's almost like braggadocio. She's saying like, these fictional objects I've envisioned, they're so amazing that my words could just never convey this to you.
Right.
But it also connects to the philosophy. Very, very nice.
And again, a lot of people will say that's a tired old science fiction trope, but it's not, because Lovecraft is the one who undercuts that gesture at the very moment of doing it, because he will go on to try to describe it. And I think the only person I've found who does it nearly as well is Edgar Allan Poe, who must have been one of his influences, even though he doesn't talk about him a lot. Poe has a way of doing that in language too.